Hello, my name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and I've got another list of 50 titles that you can get from Project Gutenberg on a particular subject. Today's subject is sports. This was probably the most difficult one to try to cobble a list of 50 together. There are some overviews of sports. There's a fair amount of juvenile fiction. There's a few items where perhaps sport isn't the purpose of the book, but there's enough sport in there to warrant its inclusion. There are a few books that I did have to give some consideration whether to include them at all. I don't regard hunting as very sporting, but it was considered a sport, so I'll keep them in there and feel free to skip the hunting. One which does have a fair amount of hunting is the first in the list, which is Xenophon's The Sportsman, and with the ancient Greeks being a fairly bloodthirsty lot, it probably turns up in Norman Gardiner's Greek athletic sports and festivals, but for antiquity, sports just doesn't seem to be much of a feature at all. And in fact, for early literature, it doesn't make an awfully great impact anyway. There is The Compleat Angler by Izaac Walton, which is about fishing, but is usually not read as a book about fishing. From 1684, we have Robert Howlett's The School of Recreation. There are some sports there which are still recognised as such. There are other forms of recreation, such as cockfighting or bear baiting, which I think are best left brushed under the carpet of history. But ladies, you can be bloodthirsty too. Ladies in the Field, Sketches of Sport by Lady Greville, and The Sportswoman's Library by Frances E. Slaughter include a fair amount of horse riding and activity, but also not a little hunting. In the Victorian era, there are some people who would love to write a book and tell you what to do, and the world of sport doesn't escape this. Walker's Manly Exercises by Donald Walker and Outdoor Sports and Games by Claude Harris Mitchell are prescriptive books about improving yourself, as well as being purportedly guides to sport. Slightly less didactic and looking to be more all-encompassing, there is Every Boy's Book, a complete encyclopedia of sports and amusements. The Handbook of Summer Athletic Sports by Fred Whittaker, and Mr. Punch's Book of Sports. Now, with one of these titles being Every Boy's Book, it shows you that a number of the books about sports are aimed at younger readers. Presumably adults have no time for sporting diversions. There is a definite parallel drawn by the writers for younger readers of sporting behaviour and how it applies to life. Hero on the school field, the camaraderie of teamwork in school sports, and a surprising amount of mystery solved along the way. There's a couple of repeated authors in this list, but normally where they have written about more than one sport. For American football, we have, or for Americans, football, we have The Winning Touchdown by Lester Chadwick, J.W. Duffield's Bert Wilson on the Gridiron, Howard Roger Garris's Dick Hamilton's Football Team, Graham B. Forbes' The Boys of Columbia High on the Gridiron, Matthew M. Colton's Frank Armstrong Drop Kicker, Ralph Henry Barber, and there is a lot of Ralph Henry Barber on Project Gutenberg, The Fighting Scrub, a little bit of baseball for variety would be Christy Matheson's 1 1/9, any number of books by H. Irving Hancock, and the Frank Merriwell series of books by Bert L. Standish. Harold M. Sherman is another writer with a fair representation on Gutenberg, but he has a book on winter sports, which is Down the Ice and Other Winter Stories. Lester Chadwick again, but this time on the water, with the 8 Oared Heroes. The Bobby Blake books by Frank A. Warner, and as a very small representation from the UK, a book about school life, but concentrating on the rugby. Tom Hughes's Tom Brown's School Days. Not only famous in itself in the UK as a book about school, but also the beginnings of the Flashman series by MacDonald, as Flashman here is the school bully. But to leave the juvenile fiction aside for a minute and be a little bit more adult, we have Edward Whymper, who was a very famous mountaineer, and his book Scrambles Amongst the Alps in the years 1860 to 69 and The Ascent of the Matterhorn. Now, I've shared a hearty fondue in the Whymper Stuber restaurant in Zermatt, so can confirm he's still a name that is known, at least in one small town. But he is by no means the only mountaineering Brit. A writer I've been looking at recently is E.F. Benson, and as well as being a writer, he was a sportsman of no mean prowess and was a gold medal standard skater and someone who had climbed the Matterhorn himself and the Jungfraujoch. I've picked 2 books by him. One is Winter Sports in Switzerland, and the other is The Cricket of Abel, Hurst and Shrewsbury. And don't worry, more cricket to come. Alice and Claude Askew had a book called The Sporting Chance, which is about professional horse racing. A writer where a number of the books are on horseback, gets out of the saddle and writes about baseball in Zane Grey's The Young Pitcher. There are also a few books about boxing. Not my favourite sport, but 2 books by Jack London, The Abysmal Brute and The Game. Kid Scanlon by H.C. Whitwer, and Arthur Conan Doyle, The Croxley Master. There are some books, as I mentioned earlier, that include sport but are not about sport, but I think are probably worth a mention. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens has a famous scene of a cricket match, so famous in fact that it ended up on a banknote. Cricket also features in the world of P.G. Wodehouse, and specifically I'd say sort of Mike and Smith, and a prefix uncle. Not just English cricket, but some Australian literature about cricket as well, and A Lad of Metal by Nat Gould. E.W. Hornung's Raffles and A Thief and a Knight are books about Raffles, the gentleman thief. But as well as being a gentleman thief by day, he is also an amateur cricketer. Staying on cricket, because it is the best sport, there is J.C. Snafe's Willow the King, A Story of a Cricket Match. There is a book about the game, simply titled Cricket, by A.G. Steele, R.H. Littleton, and some works in it by W.G. Grace. W.G. Grace was a cricketer of the Victorian era, so famous then, still famous now, and so famous that he was actually depicted to show the face of God in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. As I record this, the T20 2020 Short Form Cricket World Cup is taking place in, of all places, America. As any pub quizzer will know, the first ever international cricket match was between the USA and Canada and played in New York. And the first cricket match of this recent World Cup was a replay of that first fixture. The next book I've chosen is James Wister, A Ball for American Cricket. And to finish the cricket section, there's just a book called Cricket by Horace G. Hutchinson. Horace G. Hutchinson also wrote a book not only about my favourite sport, but about my least favourite sport, with his title 50 Years of Golf. David Drummond Bone wrote a book in praise of Scottish football. South of the border, John Cameron wrote a book called Association Football, and Walter Camp wrote a book called Football Days, a memoir or reminiscence. And at the back end of this list, back to hunting again, sorry, but for a very good reason. I found a pair of writers who both wrote about hunting, whose names may be familiar. Grover Cleveland's Fishing and Shooting Sketches, and Outdoor Pastimes of an American Hunter by Theodore Roosevelt. And finally, very finally, poetry. There's not a lot of sports poetry, but I have found 2 books by Norman Gale of poetry about cricket. I had seriously considered doing a series for the summer of sport of shorts with the various cricket poems, but I decided that was possibly suicide for any YouTube channel, so I will limit myself to just doing one here. This is Quinqueginta Annos Natus. Old bag and bat no more together, we take the train to Barnes or Tooting, no more our gallop for the leather, nor grumble when the ball keeps shooting. I've fetched her many a handsome clout at Rugby, Nottingham and Dover, so far old time has said not out, but one day he will change to over. God bless the grilling days of cricket, they're gone, but I shall bless them ever, for good it is to guard a wicket by sudden wrist and big endeavour. Don't think that I was a lazy lout who never worked for days of clover. I earned my games, time cries not out, but one day he will change to over. Well, I can stand behind the netting and watch the coach so keen and trusty, who likes to see the youngsters hitting and teaches them to let out lusty. I've had my innings, not a doubt, and stopped a crack or so at cover. I shall not funk when time says out, and all my watching days are over. So enjoy the summer of sport, as well as the Cricket World Cup. There's the small matter of the Euros, the smaller matter of the Olympic Games, the glory that is the Tour de France. I'll be back with another list or something else before long, but until then, bye.